Hello, everyone. My name is Emre Toros, and I'll be chairing this panel on EIP 2025, fifth annual virtual electoral integrity conference. Let us start with the order that is presented in the webpage, which is Bernard Tamas, Electoral Bias and Democratic Backsliding, a Global Analysis. So I'll be reminding you within the last 2-3 minutes, but if we can do this within the 15 minutes, we'll be okay, I guess, for the discussion and the questions as well. So, Bernard, are you ready?
I am ready. All right. All right. My paper, my project that I'm working on for the EIP, the title of it is the Electoral Bias and Democratic Backsliding. And what I'm doing here is I'm trying to pull together two different areas of research, one of which that I've been working on separately has been on electoral bias, which I'll go into, and the one that I guess is more consistent with what this group would be familiar with is the democratic backsliding. The title has had Hungary, India, and Turkey in it, which are important parts of it, but I'm going to be focusing on a little bit of a different aspect of it today. So, getting started. Now, we all know, of course, the Liphart's framework and his argument about majoritarian electoral systems, right? Including that and in terms of single member district systems and how they can become a threat to democracy and how part of what seems to be happening, Liphart's point is about it moving politics into a zero-sum conflict between the two major parties and how this drives polarization. And this is an important framework, and I'm not arguing with it. I'm just kind of setting up a starting point on this. And another approach that has been emerging over the last decade or so is looking at electoral aggrandizement. Executive aggrandizement should be executive aggrandizement, and that's the type of democratic backsliding. So the point of executive aggrandizement is the notion of the head of state using the legal means in order to dismantle the democratic back guardrails. The idea here, as I understand it, is more of a focus on looking at concentrations of power. So less of a focus on looking at the drives towards polarization and more about when power concentrates to one person or one small group of people. And what happens is that the idea is that there are moments when the leader of a country gains enough control that legally he or she can start dismantling democratic guardrails. Now, one of the things in the literature that I'm building off of is the argument that one of the things this type of leader needs is his or her party to be controlling the legislative branch, and that party giving lockstep support for the leader's authoritarian ambitions, right? It's, in other words, and it's almost like you could trace this logic back to James Madison. It's almost like the idea of if people don't have enough power in order to, if power is divided enough, it becomes very, very hard to actually undermine a democratic system. That you actually need to have enough support, especially if you're going to attempt to do it legally. So this is the framework that I'm building off of. Now, electoral bias, and I'll talk a little bit about electoral bias more in a minute, but the point is that electoral bias increases the chances of executive aggrandizement. And what it does is the problem becomes when you have a moment where a party with, let's say, 30% support, 40% support is catapulted into power. When the way that the electoral system is set up is it shoots a party up that wouldn't have had the be capable of winning a majority. They don't have a majority support, but they can win a majority or even a supermajority of seats in the National Assembly. And what happens there is the argument is that this is something that increases the probability of the major party putting itself into a position where it can start dismantling the democratic guardrails. It might also increase the incentive to do so, because if there's this kind of a shift, if they don't have widespread support, then it might be harder or more, there might be a bigger concern of them losing power later. And so it becomes more important for them to try to secure their positions. So the idea then is that electoral bias can increase that. So, okay, what is electoral bias? Let's go into this concept. And it's an important area of research. It's not nearly as much written on this as one might expect, but electoral bias is a concept that's used for studying electoral systems and representation. And there are different approaches and there are different measures. The most well-known approach right now is Gelman and King. It was produced in 1994, and it's this idea of partisan symmetry. And it's the whole idea that fair elections are if Party A gets 45% of the vote and still wins 55% of the seats, then it's a fair system if another party had gotten 45% of the vote and wins 55% of the seats. And it's mostly used for understanding or measuring the threat of gerrymandering. And so this is probably the best known. What I have done is approach this from a different angle. And that, in fact, if you have a situation where a party gets, let's say 40%, let's go even lower, 35% of the vote, but wins a majority of seats, then that is, regardless of whether or not it would have happened with another party, is still a threat to the democratic process, because it puts some party in a position, could put any party in a position where they can start dismantling the democratic guardrails. And so what happens is, and by the way, it could have the other, even beyond that, or a party without that support could wind up with a supermajority and wind up with enough seats in Parliament or the National Assembly in order to dismantle, to rewrite the Constitution. So what happens is what the fear is, or what my framework looks at, is the concept that this could produce a self-reinforcing system, right? What happens is, in any situation, winning seats, it becomes a way of gaining power. But it's also gaining resources. If a party wins seats, they're better for investors. It's easier to attract people. If you win government control over the government, you put yourself in a position where you're capable of actually rewriting legislation. You can even secure yourself more. And what that means, therefore, is that at the extreme, what happens is, once a party puts themselves into the position of power, if the guardrails can be disassembled, then that party is in a position to keep itself in power by undermining the democratic process.
Bernard, you're halfway.
Halfway, good. Yeah. Perfect. Okay. So the way that I look at it is that what I've developed is a concept called asymmetrical disproportionality. This is a type of electoral bias. And that asymmetrical disproportionality is when a party wins a higher percentage of seats than their percent of votes. So it's when you're winning more seats than the votes would be, fairly giving, compared to other parties. In other words, when it's pushing one party or set of parties against another. And the point of this is that this kind of bias within a system can move in a number of different directions. It could be the major parties against the smaller parties. It could be the parties on the left versus the parties on the right. It could be the first party against the second party. And so looking at it this way, it starts becoming that there are different ways that a system can run itself into problems. The measure is called DPIX, the Directional Proportionality Index. And so if you look at these numbers here, the S minus V, S is the percent seats, V is the percent votes. And look at them as in terms of sets of parties. So you could look at it with the first party in terms of how much of an increase they get versus the second party, but leaving all the other parties out. Or the first party, this is the one that I'm most interested in, versus all of the other parties, but obviously not the independents, or the major parties versus the minor parties. And so this is one where the point of this statistic is that you can play with it in order to determine different things. You can also cut it and say, well, in a mixed member system, we can separate the DPIX for the single member districts versus the multi-member districts, right? So what I did and what I've been working on lately in this part of the project is to start looking at this in terms of across different countries, in terms of trying to get a larger framework. And with doing that, what I did is two things. One of them is I used VDEM, and specifically I focused on looking at democratic backsliding, and my measure of it was a change in the liberal democracy index from 2000 to 2023. So it's just like, has it declined since 2000 up until about 2023? That's it. It's that and simple. And the electoral bias, what I did, now the thing about electoral bias and the way I measure it is these numbers jump around. And so what I did is I was like, okay, let's look at the maximum. I did it a number of ways, but this is the best one. And what happens is I'm looking at how much the DPX, how high it is. And what I did so far is focus on correlations. This is through a bootstrapping technique. Now, here is where it becomes let me show you what I think are the critical statistics on this. If we're looking at simply did the strongest party win a majority of seats? First of all, let me start with the top one. The percentage of seats and democratic backsliding, the percentage of seats the top party won is not related to democratic backsliding in this analysis. Whether or not a party won majority vote is weakly, it exists, it's a weak relationship between that and whether or not the country has declined, its democratic guardrails have been affected. But if we now look at the DPX scores, not all of them, because again, I can play with this, we can play with this a number of different ways. The top one is the one that I'm most interested in, and it's the relationship with how much the bias is for whichever party got the most votes compared to all the other political parties. And we can see that it has a strong positive relationship with democratic backsliding. The more that there's an advantage gained, that the major party gains more seats than the percent vote that it had received, the more likely the system is to backslide. And again, this were done a number of different ways. And without going into the detail, if you can see, there's three of these that are very strong. Here's what the three of them have the most in common. All of them are the ones where it's the strongest party compared to others, where there's a little mixing in on which one the other parties are. Once you start talking about any other groupings, the relationship starts to diminish. And in order to just make sure that this isn't just some spurious relationship, so that was the first step that I've taken. The second step was to start taking a look at specific countries. So I said, okay, what we do is
you have just 2 minutes left.
2 minutes. I can do it in 2 minutes. Looking at the countries with the largest decline in the liberal democracy index, and there was the measure of that was at least a 0.2. And what happened is I looked at them, and not all of them, but let's say 4 out of 5 of them followed a consistent pattern. And the consistent pattern was there was one election where the DPIX, measured the way that I was talking about, would had a sudden and significant jump when there was a significant bias in terms of a party. And I'm pretty sure in these cases, consistently a party that was out of power. And what would happen is that, so in the Hungarian case, the Fidesz party got a majority of vote, but it became a supermajority of seats. And this is what put Orban and the Fidesz party in a position to start dismantling Hungarian democracy. Poland, the Law and Justice Party, started making moves towards it, but the same process. In 2015, the DPIX was shot up for them, and that was the year they took over and started the process. Now, obviously, they're not as successful as the Hungarians are, but still, Turkey, same process in 2002. You have a massive increase of the DPIX, and this favored the Justice and Development Party, and we see that related to the decline in democracy there. India follows the same process with the rise of the BJP. Greece doesn't follow this, and I don't think this is. And again, it's really important with this area of research to emphasize this is that I'm not arguing, nor should anyone argue, that there is just one way that a country can move towards democratic backsliding. The Greece doesn't fit this pattern at all. So this is it. I'll just show one last couple of things while I have a minute or so left. The other part of this analysis is now to focus in on some of the systems, and specifically I picked India, Hungary, and Turkey, and looking at how it is that they wind up with this high level of electoral bias. And again, it is not what we always traditionally what we consider majoritarian systems. And so here, I'm just going to show this as the last one, and I'm going to stop here, is that the Hungarian system has a huge level of potential bias. It's a mixed member system that's not fully proportional. And what happens is, for a number of reasons, the bias is almost entirely coming in the single member districts. And the Fidesz group, they got some 53% of the vote, and they won practically 100% of the single member districts. And this is where it kind of shot them in. So let me just say, I'll skip over the other two, that what it basically talks about, if we're talking about guardrails, it really does show I think, suggests at least the importance of systems being proportional. Systems not because proportionality doesn't just make things fairer for larger, smaller parties, make it fairer for smaller groups. It also creates a buffer. It makes it harder for a single party to actually gain. And again, that's proportionality systems with a low enough minimum vote threshold to get in. I'll stop here. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you, Bernard. We'll continue with David and Kurt if they're here. I believe they're not, but still, let us check. They did not come up. Okay, so then we can continue with Alejandro González Ruiz from Notre Dame University. Alejandro, the place is yours.
Thank you, Emre, and thank you to the whole team of EIP for organizing the conference. This work in progress that I presented in the previous fellowship. So many of you might be familiar with the paper. Can you share my screen, and can you hear me okay?
We are all okay, I guess.
Perfect. So the title is slightly different to the one that I sent when I registered for the conference, but it's actually just the same paper. So in this paper, I am exploring contested elections and their effect in the quality of democracy, and I am assessing if the autonomy of electoral management bodies can influence the recovery of these democracies after a contested election. The interest that I have in this subject is because we have seen an increase in Latin America, not only in Latin America, in several regions, but especially in Latin America, of presidential candidates contesting election results, which is kind of a paradox because we're supposed to have at this point, and if we see the trends and the rankings according to Biden, better elections, like in terms of the management of these elections, like the electoral management bodies have achieved an important level of professionalism, and the electoral results supposed to be more trustworthy rather than in the past. However, I did an analysis of all the presidential elections in the Americas. I am including the US because of the presidential system that resembles many of the presidential systems of Latin America. In the last years from 1980 to 2025, and we can see that the yellow points represents presidential elections that were contested. And when I mean contested presidential election, I refer to an election in which one of the runner-up candidates rejected the election results, either through legal means or just simply through declarations or rallies or public declarations. For me, it's important only consider when the runner-up candidate rejected the election results, because I feel that, and according to the literature, it's more likely that the candidate that gets to the final, if he's challenging the election results, could potentially change the election outcome, rather than if just any of the candidates, for instance, in Brazil, that they have 29 political parties in the last presidential election, just simply reject the election results. So here, the yellow points that you are seeing are presidential elections that the election outcome was rejected with one of the leading candidates, either in the first round or in the second round, which is also, if we look that table related to these images, we can see Luisa González from the previous presidential election of Colombia rejecting the election results. Keiko Fujimori in Peru did the same. Evo Morales in 2019 rejected the election results of the first round. And of course, Bolsonaro during 2022 election, but we have other examples. So then what I did is to look at VDEM data and to see at the electoral index to see in which cases after the contested election, the level of democracy recovered, in which cases the level of democracy, electoral democracy remained the same, and in which cases the level of democracy got worse. And you can see all the countries that are related to the graph that I presented before. The red points are the contested elections, and the green lines are the trajectory of democracies according to VDEM. So we have cases like in Brazil, where after the 22 contested election, the quality of democracy or the level of democracy according to VDEM got better, improved. In Honduras was the opposite. In Peru was the opposite. In Bolivia, it's interesting because it went to an opposite direction right after the contested election, but it recovered very quickly in the upcoming election. And when I started analyzing these trajectories, for instance, the case of Bolivia is interesting because after the contested election, they changed the authority, the electoral management body's authorities, and they were able to organize an election that was trusted by most of the parties, and especially by international electoral observers. So for me, when I started like analyzing these trends, I said like, well, maybe it has to do with the way that EMBs authorities portray trust results. So then we can see also in this graph, in the cases in which the yellow lines represents cases where the quality of democracy or the level of democracy according to VDEM got worse, and in green cases where the level of democracy improved. Emre, please let me know if I am going beyond time. I have no a clock. I don't have a clock in front of myself, so
You're good, Alejandro. You're good.
okay.
You
Awesome.
have around 10 minutes.
Thank you. So I review what we have in the literature, but I didn't find any significant assessment of analysis that correlates contested elections and their effects on democracy and the role of electoral management bodies. However, I encountered and I found large evidence of the impact of electoral management bodies in the overall quality of democracy, legitimacy of elections, trust in elections, how they can reduce when they are autonomous and they have capacity, they can reduce or increase the cost of both buying and many other electoral malpractice. So in the case of Latin America, and that's what I'm focused right now in Latin America, but I'm potentially trying to increase my end to other regions and to analyze all the contested elections across the world. But in the case of Latin America, electoral management bodies grow as another branch of government. So we have the legislative, the executive, the judicial power, but the electoral management bodies or the electoral power was created with this idea to have like an isolated institutional body that was able to not only organize elections, but also to have the registry of citizens in the whole country and also to resolve electoral disputes. So they have in their hands an important amount of power that could potentially impact the quality of democracies before, during, and after the contested elections. And the main reason here is because when you have a contested election, you can have like two potential hypotheses. Either the candidate is right and there's some evidence that the electoral management body did something wrong. In that case, obviously, the people support and the political parties will turn their eyes to the electoral management bodies to clarify what was the issue with, let's say, voting machines or any other situation with the electoral process, the tabulation process, the disclosure of electoral results, or any part of the electoral cycle. But if the candidate is wrong, everyone will turn their eyes to the electoral management bodies to see if everything was conducted properly by the EMB, then why there are candidates complaining about the election result. And from my perspective, in my theory that I'm building, the role of the autonomy of the electoral management bodies is key, especially during contested elections, because the contested elections is kind of a test of the level of autonomy of these institutions. If the candidate is right about he or her complaint about the election result, then the EMB should clarify the information and should repeat the count of certain districts or try to clarify it with transparent information the election results. But if the candidates are wrong, they should stand with uphold the original results and defend the original results. And I think that that's the case that happened in most of the cases where the quality of democracy, according to them, improve. So for this paper, the research question that I have is how does the autonomy of EMBs influence democratic resilience following a contested elections? And my hypothesis is that countries with more autonomous EMBs are more likely to experience democratic resilience following a contested election. My dependent variable is democratic resilience understood as the level of electoral democracy after a contested election, according to Videm. My independent variable is the autonomy of EMB. I'm also taking autonomy from Videm. However, I created like a dummy variable because in Videm, as you may know, the scale is from 0 to 4. So I divided just the countries, those below 2 and those above 2 as zeros and 1. My unit of analysis were countries with contested presidential elections. So I had 22 cases out of 179 presidential elections from 1980 to 2024. I'm just considering elections after the third wave of democratization. And I'm using in my research design just a simple linear regression model. I'm trying to test this model to see if we can predict the level of democracy after a contested election, given the level of autonomy of an electoral management body before and during the contested election. So these are the preliminary results that I got. Those are not significant as I was expected. However, we can see a positive correlation between the level of democracy and the EMB autonomy, and a negative correlation with the contested election affecting the level of democracy. So what I'm doing next in this research is, well, first of all, trying to increase my N. I am conducting the analysis of elections across different regions. And a really important piece of advice that I got from Holly recently is that I might use an analysis of all the elections without thinking in if they were contested or not, and looking into the cases where the level of democracy got worse, and to see if in those cases we can see a potential correlation with the level of autonomy, to avoid any noise with my hypothesis from the beginning. However, another thing that I did is that I took the average of all the countries that had contested elections in this period of time, and I analyzed the average of the level of EMB autonomy in the cases where the level of democracy improved and in the cases where the level of democracy got worse. And what we can see in this graph that I am comparing is that in those cases where the level of democracy improved, the level of EMB autonomy was significantly higher than in those cases where the level of democracy got worse, where EMB autonomy was significantly lower. Of course, here it might be some problems of endogeneity. I'm trying to incorporate other variables into my analysis and the regression, such as the level of polarization, and if the fragmentation of political parties and so on. So I'm open to receive any feedback that you may have in terms of how can I strengthen my hypothesis. And thank you so much for the opportunity.
Thank you very much, Alejandro. And we are quite on time. Then we can continue with Erik Asplund, who is a senior advisor on elections and crisis at International IDEA, Institute for Democracy and Electoral Assistance. Erik, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Emre. Let me see if I can get my slideshow going here. Just give me a second. Okay, can everyone see?
Yes, just make it full screen, down right or there, anyway. Yes.
How about that?
That would be fine.
That looks good
Yes,
to everyone?
yes, we are all okay. Yeah.
Okay. So let me just see here. Okay. All right. So perfect. So thank you, Emre. As mentioned, my name is Erik Asplund, and I'm a senior advisor at International IDEA. For those of you that are not familiar with International IDEA, it's an intergovernmental organization with 35 member states that supports democracy worldwide. I'd like to first, of course, thank the Electoral Integrity Project, together with the Carter Center, for hosting this conference and for inviting me to speak about the impact of natural hazards on the 2024 elections. Let me see if this works. Okay, Emre, I'm trying to just change this.
It didn't move at all?
Oh, it's,
yes,
yeah,
now
now it's moving, like nothing. Okay. Thank you so much. So my presentation today is based on a chapter that I co-authored together with Maddie Hardy on the impact of natural hazards on 2024 elections, which can be found on International IDEA's and the Electoral Integrity Project report called A Review of the Supercycle Year of Elections, which was published on the 9th of June. The report, edited by Toby James, Holly and Garnett, and myself, includes several chapters on various electoral integrity challenges, such as natural hazards, but also on election-related violence, disinformation during elections, electoral malfunction, and so on. So it's definitely worth having a look. It's open source and free to download on IDEA's website. So also I'd like to mention that International IDEA has a project page on the topic, which includes publications and analysis. Here you also find our election and emergency and crisis monitor dashboard, which includes 70 plus briefs on the topic between 2021 and 2024. As well as 11 case studies, including the one that you authored, Emre, on the 2023 earthquake and the general elections in Turkey, but also on other case studies such as on the US, Haiti, Mozambique, and so on. Now, these case studies will eventually, I hope, inform a book that I'm working on together with Sarah Birch from King's College London and Ferran Martinez-Icoma from Griffith University, which we will hopefully have at the end of this year. To provide a little bit of context, the year 2024 was described as the super cycle election year, primarily because 1.6 billion people voted in 74 national elections in 62 countries in the same calendar year. Now, this was due to a convergence in national elections, something that occurs every 4 to 5 years. And something we will probably not see anything similar until about 20 years. But I think what is very unique here is that so many people voted, and this is nothing we've seen in our democratic history. But what is also extraordinary is that disasters and extreme weather events disrupted 20 elections at different levels in 15 countries. This included tropical storms, floods, heat waves, wildfires, volcanic eruptions that destroyed critical infrastructure such as roads, polling stations, and election materials, and also disrupted electoral timetables. Many disasters also led to displaced voters, and in some cases, the deaths of voters and poll workers, all of which provide evidence of how the climate crisis is tangibly having an impact on democracy. The impact of disasters on elections varied, of course, based on the type of hazard, the level of exposure to the hazard, and the vulnerability of the exposed population. Beyond climate change, the El Nino was also a contributing factor. Just to give you a general overview of the hazards that affected elections by type, floods, heat waves, and tropical storms were the most common type of hazards to affect elections in 2024. Winter weather, wildfires, and volcanic eruptions also had an impact on elections, but were not as common. In some cases, hazards affected more than one election in a country. This was the case in, for example, Austria, Indonesia, and the US. In the US, freezing temperature and snow in January 2024 disrupted the Iowa caucus. Wildfires affected the presidential primaries in Texas, which were held in March. There was a heat wave in June that affected campaign events in Arizona and Nevada. And between August and October 2024, hurricanes Debbie, Milton, and Helen disrupted registration and voting operations in several southern eastern states. Moreover, on election day, on the 5th of November, two polling officials died because of floods in Missouri. So how does this 2024 snapshot look in comparison with recent years? Well, according to the International IDEA's Election Emergency and Crisis Monitor, 33 countries were affected by natural hazard during election periods between 2019 and 2024, meaning 17% of 195 globally recognized countries have struggled with disasters during elections. This number is further supported by survey results from the Electoral Integrity Project, the Electoral Management Survey, So out of 50 respondents, 13 or 26% indicated that elections in the previous 5 years had been adversely affected by natural hazards other than COVID-19. When electoral management bodies were asked as part of the survey whether natural environmental factors such as extreme weather events were impacting their work, 4 or 12% out of the 33 respondents answered the question that their work had been somehow or affected on a regular basis, right? So this is only one count. And then we had, so often on a regular basis or often. So this, I think this clearly suggests that natural hazards are a concern shared by many election officials around the globe. The response to extreme weather events during election periods in 2024 depended to a great extent on the type of hazard, the likelihood and the scale of the resulting disaster, and the time in which the disaster occurred in their jurisdiction's election calendar. Many of the 15 countries showed resilience by activating legal, institutional, or management safeguards during different phases of the electoral cycle. This typically included changes in administrative voting procedures, such as moving polling station locations and election materials, adjusting registration and voting requirements, introducing health and safety measures, and in some cases, postponing elections in municipalities heavily affected by a disaster. Moreover, many election management bodies exhibited a whole-of-government approach by collaborating with national disaster agencies to mitigate the impact of the disaster, especially to reduce the health risks. For example, with the support of the National Disaster Management Authority, the Election Commission of India introduced health and safety guidelines and measures, including water, tents, and medical kits at polling stations. These measures were introduced because of a heat wave that affected many parts of India during the election period. Despite these protective measures, there were reports of voters and poll workers losing consciousness or dying because of heat-related illnesses. Undoubtedly, the health risks would have been much higher if not for the efforts of the election management body and other national agencies. In some cases, election management bodies cannot hold elections due to the scale of the disaster. This was the case in Bosnia and Herzegovina, which had undergone flooding and landslides only days before the October 2024 local elections. In this case, after consultations with local election commissions that had first-hand information on the unfolding situation, the Central Election Commission postponed elections in 5 municipalities for humanitarian and logistical reasons for 14 to 28 days. Elections for the rest of the country were held on schedule. Now, despite the legal safeguards allowing the Central Election Commission to postpone elections for up to 30 days, there was notable weaknesses in interagency cooperation. For example, the Central Election Commission was not part of the Federal Protection and Rescue Coordination Mechanism, leading to a lack of formal information and updates about the situation in the affected municipalities. An interesting question is what EMBs around the world have been doing in recent years to protect elections. Again, the survey conducted by the Electoral Integrity Project sheds some light on this question. The survey, which again includes 50 respondents worldwide, indicate that most common strategy for protecting against disasters was contingency planning. That was roughly about 58% answered yes to this question. Interagency cooperation was also common, practiced by just under half of all EMBs included in the survey. The introduction of risk management frameworks and special voting arrangements were somewhat less common, but still popular. Now, it's clear from the examples and data presented that many election management bodies worldwide have kind of risen to the challenge of natural hazards. developing, I think, innovative and place-specific means of defending the integrity and robustness of their electoral processes against such threats. So just a few words on the lessons learned and policy recommendations. So extreme weather worsened by climate change will, I guess, continue to affect countries and electoral processes around the globe. Therefore, policymakers and election officials should consider climate adaptation in their planning and decision-making to build resilience against the impact of natural hazards on elections. This could include designating electoral processes as part of critical infrastructure, enhancing government cooperation between election management bodies and national disaster, meteorological and health agencies, and facilitating emergency funding. Meanwhile, election management bodies should strengthen risk management frameworks, contingency plans, and training efforts. That's it for me. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Erik, for the presentation. Now, I guess we can turn to our discussant, Leontine. We have, I believe, you have 2 papers to comment on, Leontine. Okay.
Yeah, that's true. Thank you very much, and
Okay,
thank
please
you.
go on. Thank you.
Thank you for the organizers for once again hosting this amazing conference. I have 2 papers to discuss, the paper by Bernard and the paper by Alejandro. I'll start with the paper by Bernard. I think it's a really interesting paper. I really enjoyed reading it because you touch upon a very important and, as you correctly say, understudied topic of how does electoral bias influence the outcome of elections and how does it relate to democratic backsliding. I do have a couple of questions. I'm not an expert in the field, so I might ask very dumb questions, but I hope you can enlighten me. What I was wondering is in your data set, you're looking to only at countries where there was actually democratic backsliding, and then you look at the question whether the electoral bias could be related to that. But I was wondering if you could also see the opposite effect, because you could also argue that in a country where there is a lot of electoral bias, it could also provide a party that's really in favor of strengthening democracy with a majority over time, and then do the opposite and strengthen democracy. And I was also wondering, because you state in the case of Hungary that at some point the socialists did indeed have a beneficial effect from the electoral bias. So I was wondering, why didn't they use that period to strengthen the constitution in a way that it made it more difficult for parties that want to go the other direction to change the constitution. So I was wondering a little bit if you're looking only at countries that are going back in that level of democracy, and why you should not also apply the theory to countries that are actually improving because certain parties won because of the bias. The other question I had is, well, you rightly said in the presentations, Greece is a kind of a weird case, and I would really challenge you to also include Greece in the paper and to see why it is that you see the numbers in Greece, but you don't see the level of democratic backsliding, because otherwise you tend to run the risk that you are accused of picking cases that fit your theory and then not discussing the cases that might not completely fit your theory. So I would really ask you to pay attention to that. And then I have a couple of smaller remarks. For example, currently in the Netherlands, I mean, we do have a very proportional system. We have a coalition government. We're also experiencing democratic backsliding. If we look at the way parliamentarians talk about the courts, if we look at the way parliamentarians talk about, and even our current government talk about the role of the media and the independence of media. So I was also wondering if there's not just a more general trend towards democratic backsliding, which might be strengthened a little bit more in the countries that have electoral bias, but is also very much something that just happens currently all over the world. And if you need to expand your theory and your literature a little bit more about that, because I think you do say correctly, it's not the only thing that helps democratic backsliding, but I think there is also a lot of democratic backsliding going on in countries that do have a proportional system without a big electoral bias. So that was my remarks on your paper, but overall really interesting, and I hope to see the expanded version where you include the third case country of Turkey as well.
We can continue, Leontine, I guess, with the second paper of Alejandro's.
Thank you very much. Once again, a very interesting paper. A lot to unpack there. I think overall in the balance of the paper, there's a lot attention towards basically the prescriptive part of the existing literature and all the earlier work, and then in the balance of the paper, I think the discussion of your model is lacking a bit in terms of if you're not completely aware of what questions are in the VDEM data on which capture EMB autonomy. It's kind of hard to follow the model because it's described very briefly what kind of variables you're using, and also I'm missing a bit of discussion there on in the first part of the paper. You really rightfully state that autonomy is more than just legal autonomy, and there's also a lot of papers from the EIP based on their earlier data sets on, well, you also have to have factual autonomy, and you have to have a budget, and you have to have personnel and everything, capacity. But then in the model, it's not really clear what kind of factors from VDEM you're using to capture that actual independence, or if it's just the more legal independence. So I think if you want to move this paper forward, I would spend a little bit more time explaining your model so that the reader who's not completely in the VDEM model also understands what variables you're taking and why you're taking that variable. I was missing a little bit the role of the courts in contested elections because you're focusing a lot on the role of EMBs, but I think in very contested elections, the EMB is the first part of the filter, and then the courts come into play. So I was wondering if you maybe could expand a little bit on that counterplay between EMBs and courts. So yeah, I think those are the basic, my main points are where I think you can improve. So a little bit more explanation of your model and your findings, and placing the EMBs in the larger system of institutions that guarantee elections.